I would like to welcome you, all the guests and students and friends and everybody who came to listen to today's lecture. I am happy to see you here, and I know that you will hear something extraordinary, interesting and important. Dr. Patterson, I would like to introduce first for all of you who have not been here last night. He is professor at Memphis University. He also is co-editor of the Weinstein series of Washington University. The title of that series is Post-Holocaust Studies. He is author of more than 30 books. I cannot start to list them because it would take away from his lecture. But you might want to see them, you might want to look into all these books or just into a few major books in Holocaust studies as well as in philosophy, Jewish philosophy, the Kabbalah, and Russian literature, and a number of other territories in which he is interested. So I would like to ask Professor Patterson to come, and we are all very much interested in what you have to say.
Thanks so much. It's good to see some of you again. Some of you were here yesterday. My talk this morning is a little different. It's much more of a text-based talk, and the text that I'm basing the talk on is what I call the Black Book of Lithuanian Jewry. As you may know, by the summer of 1942, July of 1942, when the massive transports to the 6 murder camps were in full swing, the Einsatzgruppen, the killing units, the 4 killing units that had followed the Nazi army to the east, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, had murdered, the official figure for many years was between 1.4 and 1.6 million Jews already. I have a colleague in Moscow at the Holocaust Studies Center, which has been in existence only for about 10 years, who tells me, no, it's closer to 3 million after his work in KGB files. Some of you may have heard of the work of Patrick Dubois, a Catholic priest in the Ukraine, who has discovered more than 800 heretofore unknown mass graves just in the Ukraine. He estimates just in the Ukraine more than 1 million were murdered excuse me, by killing units that no one had known about till recent times. Of course, one of the reasons for this, why didn't anybody know, you may wonder. Keep in mind that the Soviets were the first to arrive at most of the camps. Certainly all the camps in the East. And the Soviets were not known to share information about anything with anybody. However, on the Russian front, during the war, there were journalists, among whom was Ilya Ehrenberg, who was actually a very well-known and somewhat controversial Russian Jewish author. Part of the controversy around him is that he enjoyed the favor of the Stalinist regime for quite some time, but although, like all other Jews, he eventually fell out of favor. And almost immediately, Ehrenberg set about gathering information and evidence on Nazi activities in the East as the army advanced to the East. And he collected diaries and letters and affidavits. He collected testimonies from Soviet investigating committees and compiled what was known as simply as the Chornaya Kniga, the Black Book. Portions of the Black Book were first published in the Russian periodical in 1944, the periodical called Znamya. Znamya, which means the banner. There was an edition, a volume, a book, and not in a, Znamya is a periodical. It was published in a book form for the first time in Romania in 1946. However, by this time, as I said, not just Ehrenberg, but Jews in general had seriously fallen out of favor with the Soviets. As you may know, the Soviets never used the term Holocaust and never referred to extermination of Jews. They referred to, when they did mention it, the murder of Soviet citizens by the fascists. When there was finally a memorial at Babi Yar, 25 years after the slaughter had taken place, there was no mention of Jews on that memorial. So early on, under Stalin, efforts were made to confiscate the few manuscript copies of the Black Book. The galley, there were plates, galley plates for publishing the book had been made, and there was a set of galley proofs that was about to go to press. When it was confiscated, the plates were destroyed, and all but one copy was lost. That one copy was retrieved by Abraham Sutzkever, about whom I'll say more, taken in 1965. So he smuggled it out of Russia, Soviet Union. In 1965, he turned it over to Yad Vashem. And in 1981, the first English edition of the Black Book was published by Yad Vashem. However, it had big pieces missing. The entire section on Lithuania was missing. Now, in the Black Book, I mentioned it's first-hand accounts, eyewitness accounts, testimonies, but it's divided into countries. Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Lithuania, Russia, countries and regions. So the Lithuania piece was missing, as were some other pieces of it. When the Soviet regime fell in 1991, the KGB files were opened, and there's still researchers in Moscow from all over the world going through those files, which are massive, every day, for all kind, not just for information on the extermination of the Jews, but for all kinds of reasons. The Black Book portion was found, and it was published under the title Neizdanaya Chornaya Kniga, the unpublished Black Book, now published. That came out in 91, almost immediately. The daughter of Ilya Ehrenberg, Irina Ehrenberg, was also researching the files, going through the files. She gathered the Lithuanian portion and other portions and put it into probably the most complete single volume of the Black Book, which was published in Vilnius in 1993 in Russian. Although the Black Book can be found in Russia, it has never actually been published by a Russian publisher. Now, in 1996, a friend of mine named Helen Siegel, who is a Russian literature scholar and a Holocaust survivor, came to me and said, this Irina, she was a friend of Irina Ehrenberg, says, my friend Irina has published this volume. It needs to be translated into English. Will you do it? And we're talking about a volume that's the manuscript form, in manuscript form is about 1,600 pages long. And of course, my inclination was to say, I don't want to do that. But somebody had to do it. So I did it. And I asked Helen, is there any way that I could sit down with Irina and discuss it with her, get her work on getting together, missing portions of it. including the Lithuanian portion, which is itself is like 300 manuscript pages. And she said, sure. So this was in 1997. Helen, my friend, had arranged for me to get the invitations from a university president, all the official invitations, so I could just get permission to enter the country. I had been to the Soviet Union, and it was much easier, for me anyway, to get into the Soviet Union than it was to get into Russia. In any case, I had everything. I had all those ducks lined up, and just a few days before I was supposed to leave, the Russians said, you can't come into this country. No explanation. Maybe it had to do with, I told them I wanted to meet with Irina Ehrenberg and would discuss. I don't know why, but anyway, they refused me permission, and I went instead to Yad Vashem, where probably the single largest Ehrenberg archives are kept anyway. So I was going through what Black Book materials they had at Yad Vashem. I'm sitting in the library, this is in Jerusalem, and the librarian comes up to me, hands me an obituary from a Moscow newspaper indicating that Irina Ehrenberg had died on the day I was supposed to meet with her. So it wasn't meant to be. Now, in working on the Black Book, as you can imagine, is extremely difficult. I mean, translation is an extremely tedious task in any case, but when you're translating one account of horror after horror after horror after horror, it does a number on you. It was a difficult task. One of the things I realized is that what the Nazis did was not unimaginable. It was everything imaginable. They would have, make bets among themselves as to who could come up with the most ingenious way of torture or murder. The imagination was the only limit. This is an important distinction between the actions of, say, the Crusaders in the Rhineland or the Khmelnytsky massacres in Poland and the Ukraine in 1649. Namely, in those massacres of Jews at the hands of Christians, you still had among the Christians people who could object and remain a Christian. You have among the Christians texts and teachings and traditions that say, don't murder. We're going against God's will. We have our commandments which tell us this is wrong. We can't do it. We're going too far. In National Socialist thinking, there is no limiting principle that would determine a limit. You're going too far. The imagination was the only limit. And the Black Book is evidence of that. Now, I want to talk just briefly this morning about 4 parts of the Black Book of Lithuanian Jewry. One is Abraham Sutskever's History of the Vilna Ghetto. The other is the diary of Eliezer Yerushalmi, a member of the Jewish Council of the Shavli Ghetto. I have some remarks about the Kovno Ghetto and the death forts, and some remarks finally about the diary, a relatively rare document, the diary of a righteous Gentile in Kovno. This is the English edition of what's called the Complete Black Book, and this is where the Lithuanian Black Book appears for the first time in English, but if anyone's interested in that. Abraham Sutskever, as you may know, was himself an important literary figure in Jewish literature, Yiddish literature. He's a recipient of the Israel Prize for Literature. He was one of the commanders in the fighting organization in the Vilna Ghetto. He worked very hard to preserve documents and testimonies himself. Vilna, as you know, was what was known as the Jerusalem of the East, the Jerusalem of Europe. Since the late 16th, early 17th century, Vilna was a center of Jewish learning. The Vilna Shas is the edition of the Talmud that most of us still use. The YIVO Institute was headquartered in Vilna. The Vilna Gaon, one of the great sages of modern times, 18th century figure. So Vilna was really the center of Jewish life, Jewish consciousness, Jewish learning until June 24th, 1941, when the Nazis entered Vilna and began their oppression and ultimately the murder of the Jews of Vilna. Sutzkever says that from the day the Nazis entered, the Jews were forbidden to use the telephone, ride on a train, go to public places, own a radio, speak to non-Jews, and certainly to attend school. On the 6th of September, 1941, the ghetto was already set up. Jews were transferred into the ghetto where they were forbidden to look outside the ghetto. This is a typical measure. Elie Wiesel mentions it at night, that the windows had to be sealed that were looking outside of the ghetto. So they're sealed into the anti-world on the other side, so to say. Already, they were forbidden to speak German, discuss politics, wear a beard, or eat fat. Women were forbidden to color their hair, to use lipsticks. No flowers were allowed. And of course, prayer was immediately labeled an act of sedition, as it had already been in Poland, Polish ghettos. Something I commented on yesterday. I mean, prayer is a means of not only addressing God, but hearing God address us. We have this understanding of prayer as a means of God speaking to us through our own lips. And therefore we begin the 18 benedictions, the Amida, by saying, "O Lord, open my lips, and I will sing your praise," a line from the Psalms. Anyway, this assault on prayer is attested to in Sutzkever's history of the Vilna ghetto, although Sutzkever himself was not what you would call a Hasid. He was not particularly religious. He also records the targeting of children as first targets in the ghetto. He records the efforts of a woman named Mira Bernstein to save children as best she could. He records the fact that very soon pregnancy became a capital crime. To be pregnant was a crime in the Vilna ghetto. So you see, once again, it's not just mothers, but motherhood who come under an assault here. Quoting Sutzkever, he says, "And yet the people in the ghetto tried to avert this cannibalistic order in every way. They hid women. They hid the infants in a secluded place where mothers could nurse the little ones. Once the babies had grown a little, they were listed in old ghetto registers. Jewish women retained their right to motherhood." But so you might say, I mean, people will hear this and say, well, there were still Jewish mothers. Okay, but they in hiding, in seclusion, that's not whether there were still mothers is not the point. It's the principle involved in this assault on the mothers and on children, on motherhood and on children. Sutzkever's history includes a number of testimonies from Panari, taken from people that he himself recorded, from people who either escaped from the mass graves at Panari. Panari was a huge killing site, as you know, outside of Vilnius. Or from the Brenners, those who in 1944 were part of the detail digging up the bodies and burning them at Panari. That detail, that group of Jews, staged an uprising against their Nazi guards, killed them, and escaped. However, by the time they had managed to do that, they had burned, according to Sutzkever, 56,800 bodies, which is less than half buried at Panari. One of the survivors of Panari gives the following testimony. It's a little grim of what he saw. when he arrived at Pinardi. He says, the grass was red with blood. The entire field was littered with bodies. Trees were splattered with brains. Mutilated children lay beside the tree trunks, many of whom were torn in half. One leg lying here, another there. There was a pile of children's heads. Identification papers, visitors' cards, photographs, banknotes were scattered everywhere. In one spot lay the body of a German with his throat torn out. A Jew had killed him. That's Pinardi. One of the Brenners, the ones who were burning the bodies, named Isaac Dagim, by the way, was interviewed by Claude Lanzmann in Shoah, describes how he came across the body of his wife as he was exhuming bodies to be burned. He recognized her by the locket around her neck that he had given her. By the locket, you understand. Isaac Dagim's testimony is in Sutzkever's history. Sutzkever makes it clear that in this realm, it's a realm in which a man might dig up his wife's body before himself being murdered, marked for murder, is a realm created systematically by the highest levels of the German intelligentsia. It was not random. It was not, mob run amok. Nothing of that sort. He cites the example of a man that he refers to as Professor Hogarth of the University of Berlin, who created, Sutzkever says, a codex where in 500 paragraphs he outlined the system for the mass murder of a people. He also points out, and I'll say more about this shortly, that the Nazis could not have accomplished their aims without the active and enthusiastic cooperation of the Lithuanian people. And as I said, I'll comment on that in connection with some other portions of the Lithuanian Black Book shortly. And one other thing I think I need to mention, should always be mentioned in this connection, in his history, is he also is careful to memorialize the righteous among the Lithuanians. Most Lithuanians were not so righteous. There were a few. Sutzkever himself was saved by a Lithuanian. He has a very interesting account of, an unusual account, at least in my studies, of a German master sergeant named Anton Schmidt, who was helping the Jews of the Vilna ghetto, who would drive Jews from Vilna to Bialystok to Warsaw, and he became part of that network of Jewish resistance. He took Mordechai Tannenbaum to Bialystok. And unfortunately, in April 1942, Schmidt was arrested and executed by the Nazis. So even the man in the Nazi uniform offered some help to the Jews of Vilna. And then, of course, there's the uprising in the Vilna ghetto, which Sutzkever relates in detail and in which he participated. He and a few others escaped the ghetto. When he escaped, he joined a partisan unit in the Narosh forest in the region, and spent the rest of the war with the partisans. He relates very, very dramatically the story of Isaac Wittenberg, one of the leaders of the Vilna ghetto fighters, who turned himself in to avoid the ghetto being destroyed by the Nazis. A Nazi commander named Kittel issued the order that unless Wittenberg is turned over to the Gestapo, he would order the incendiary bombing of the ghetto. He would have bombers flown in from Kaunas to bomb the Vilna ghetto. And of course he said, we just want to talk with him. You know, we'll release him after we interrogate him. And Wittenberg, needless to say, was tortured to death by the Nazis. Let me go, just in the interest of my time here, to the diary of Eliezer Yerushalmi. Remarkable document. I spoke with students yesterday a little bit about Jewish councils. I spoke a little bit in the talk about Jewish councils, which is an incredible tale in and of itself, the position that members of the Jewish councils were placed in. Eliezer Yerushalmi was a member of the Shavli Jewish Council, as I mentioned. His diary, as it's published in the Black Book, runs from February 1943 through November 43, so it's not a long time. Like most Holocaust diaries, his is written with very little concern about himself, very little complaint about himself. He is a voice for the sake of the Jewish people, for the sake of the Jewish community, attesting to the horrors of the Nazis and the efforts of the Jews to resist. Now keep in mind, whenever you come across one of these diaries, first of all, that the diaries, and then including this one, many of them, most of them were written at the risk of one's life. They were written under impossible conditions. They were written in a place where writing materials were scarce, where you shared a room with 8 other people, where you don't have a lamp. You have to be careful that you're not caught. They're written often by people who are starving and in states of exhaustion. So just the fact that someone would take up a pen and record anything is absolutely extraordinary. Yerushalmi's diary has, I think, valuable information about labor camps that probably most of us here are not familiar with, like Bakhuni, Linkachii, Dogilai, Pavencia, Akmian. Those are probably not names that everyone is familiar with, right? It's not like Buchenwald and Stutthof that everybody knows. So you have information on camps that are very little known. You have information on one of the more notorious of the murderers in the Shavli region, a man named Albert Forster. Albert Forster was the man who gave the order that all Jewish children under 10 years of age in Shavli and the area, camps in the area, were to be shot. That order was issued on 25 October 1943. About 2 weeks later, the roundups began. And when they were rounding up the children of the Shavli ghetto, 3 of the Jewish council members went out into the streets and placed themselves between the Nazis and the children. They, of course, went with the children. They were trying to stop it. Interestingly, just a month before that, before the order to murder the children had come, in August 1943, a Jew was caught for one of the most serious crimes a Jew could commit in the ghetto, bringing food into the ghetto. Bringing food into a place where the ration was around 220, 230, the legal ration, 230 calories a day. The man in charge, the chief of the Gestapo, a man named Mak, M-A-K-K, went to the Jewish council and said, I need you to have 50 Jews report tomorrow morning to the Gestapo. Of course, they knew exactly what that meant. The council met and voted unanimously to refuse the order and to show up themselves at the Gestapo office saying, "Here we are. There won't be 50 Jews reporting to you today." Interestingly, the Gestapo officer revoked that demand and instead leveled a very heavy fine on the Jews, as a part of the process of plundering the Jews of all they had before they were murdered. And I mean literally all they had. So you have, in the case of Eliezer Yerushalmi's diary, some very interesting testimony on activities of Jewish councils, ways in which Jewish councils actually tried to help. In this case, they would help the partisan effort. There wasn't much of an organized fighting organization in the Chablis ghetto itself. But you have evidence of the systematic targeting of children, and the evil of the Nazis. The evil of the Nazis. Speaking of the evil of the Nazis, among the most notorious of the killing centers in Lithuania was located in Kovno. And in Kovno, the 9th Fort was notorious as a killing site. But there wasn't just the 9th Fort. The Lithuanian Black Book has extensive information on killings at the 4th, 6th, and 7th forts. In Kovno, there's a system of fortresses in place to protect the city, going back 100 or more years. And it turned out that the fortresses that were designed to protect the residents of Kovno became the sites of their murder. In the section on Kovno Ghetto, there's the Lithuanian Black Book records that 3 days after launching the invasion of June 22nd, 1941, about 1,000 Jews in the Kovno suburb of Vilyamnopol were murdered. This included the beheading of Rabbi Osofsky, the head of the Vilyamnopol yeshiva. It records cutting out tongues, gouging out eyes. They, however, who committed this murder were not Nazis. They were Lithuanians. And this activity, this particular action of the Lithuanians is recorded in a report filed by Einsatzgruppe A, on 15 October 1941. That report says, "It is important for the sake of the future to have proof that the liberated population, on its own initiative, took active and energetic measures against the enemy, the Bolsheviks and the Jews, so that the German authorities did not have to expose themselves. During the first pogrom," the report goes on the night of 25-26 June, Lithuanian partisans killed more than 1,500 Jews. They burned and destroyed several synagogues and completely burned down more than 60 buildings in the Jewish quarter. On the following night, approximately 2,300 Jews were killed. It's important for the sake of the future. The liberated population took measures against the enemy. You might think, I thought the Russians were the enemy. I thought the Soviets were the ones we were at war with. No. The Jew is the enemy. By the end of June, within 2 weeks, the prisons of Kovno were filled to capacity, and that's when the Nazis began sending people to the various forts. In July, a month later, in late July of 1941, just to give you an indication of the Nazi thinking here, there was an athletic competition, something like a track and field meet for women. And the prize for the winning women's team was that they would have the honor of personally shooting 25 Jews taken from the 7th Fort. First prize. Of course, the Jewish intelligentsia is always marked and rounded up. In August 1941, the intelligentsia of Jews were collected. The Black Book records 711 members, Jewish professionals of Kovno were murdered on 18 August 1941, in addition to another 698 Jewish men, 402 Jewish women, and 1 Pole. The sixth fort in Kovno served as a Soviet prisoner of war. And as you know, the Nazis were especially brutal toward the Soviet prisoners of war. About 35,000 Soviet POWs were in the sixth fort. Many of the Soviet POWs were used to dig up graves in the region and burn bodies. So it wasn't just only Jews who were put on details like that. It happened often that Soviet prisoners were taken out in the middle of a field, given some lumber and tools, and told, build your own camp. Build your own POW camp. Till you get it built, you're going to sleep in the field. We're talking about Eastern Europe, right? Where the weather is not always that great. The Black Book gives a chronicle of the operation in 1943 to burn the bodies in the mass graves in the vicinity of the Ninth Fort, which was known. The Nazis referred to the Ninth Fort as the Kaunas Vernichtungsstelle, the Kaunas Annihilation Center. It even indicates that those who were on the detail digging up bodies had to meet a quota of burning at least 600 per day, and they were held very, very sternly and strictly to that quota. The Kovno Jewish Council was very active, according to this account, in helping, again, partisan units in the area. They worked to smuggle youngsters out of the ghetto, help them to join partisan units. And it does have some testimony from one of the partisan unit fighters named Chaim Elim, E-L-I-M. And so you have in this account of Kovno an extraordinary account of brutality, evil, murder, courage, resistance in these few pages. Finally, let me comment just in the time I have left on the diary of a woman, a physician named Dr. Elena Vividaite Hutorgina, whom I'll just refer to as Elena today. Elena was one of the righteous among the nations who lived in Kovno, the ghetto, the city that I've just been discussing. Her diary runs from the 23rd of June, 1941, just to the 31st of December, 1941. So it's only about 6 months. But when you read her diary, again, she has almost no complaint about her own suffering. She has no expression of pride in her actions. But she does say that, it's impossible to live when someone next to you is suffering. She says, I'm constantly thinking about the ghetto. There's no way I can forget about those people so close to me. The people arrested, all of them wound me. She says, once you've started doing good, it is impossible to stop. You keep going, even though you're terrified. One of the things she documents in her diary it's not just her efforts to help, but the Lithuanians' allegiance to Hitler. And she confirms what by now I suppose is common knowledge, that the Lithuanians had no love for the Jews, that the Lithuanians were active participants in the murder of the Jews of Lithuania. They participated in a number of actions that the Nazis themselves, undertook. She relates that in Kovno, there was a Jewish hospital in Kovno. She was a doctor and she worked in that hospital, and she knew a number of Jews. She had patients who were Jews. She relates that the Germans burned down the ghetto hospital with the patients and personnel inside. They brought gasoline and sprayed it through the windows. They loaded the children from the children's ward into a truck and hauled them off somewhere to be murdered. The weak patients, people who had been operated on, women who had given birth, the paralyzed could not be saved since it was all done so fast without warning. That's another example in this testimony of how the Nazis operate. When she comments on what she calls the Lithuanian savagery, she too, like others like Abasutskaya, points out that the Lithuanians who were so savage were not uneducated thugs and brutes. She found almost no one among the physicians she knew who had any use for Jews at all. She says that they were all supportive of the German victory. They lauded the German entry into Lithuania as if they were being liberated somehow, and as if that would mean Lithuanian independence somehow from Soviet rule, Soviet influence. Of course, Lithuanian independence, she explains, in the mouth of the Lithuanian nationalists means a Judenrein Lithuania, a Lithuania purged of its Jews. She also indicates, I think for the time and place that she's writing, a deep understanding of exactly what is going on. She says Jews were expelled from various places during the Middle Ages, but they have never known this cruelty that we have witnessed when the complete slaughter of all the Jewish people, down to the last one, is a policy of a government. She quotes an article published in 1941 by Joseph Goebbels in the fall of 1941, November, in an issue of an SS periodical called Das Reich, in which Goebbels says the following. He says, "The historical guilt of world Jewry for starting and continuing the war is so evident that there's no need to speak of the matter. The Jews wanted to have their war, well, now they have it. The prophecy made by the Führer on the 30th of January 1939 in the German Reichstag is being fulfilled. If the Jewish imperialist financiers should once again plunge the people into a war, the result will not be the Bolshevization of the globe and the triumph of the Jews, but rather the destruction of the Jewish race in Europe. We are now living through the fulfillment of that prophecy." The mass extermination project was not an accidental byproduct of a bureaucracy run amok, as some maintain. There's plenty of evidence in this volume to that effect. Let me just offer a couple of concluding thoughts. As I discussed yesterday, what you see as evidenced in the Black Book, the Lithuanian Black Book, the Black Book in general, is something that is not reducible to racism or xenophobia or scapegoating or envy or any of the usual contingencies that we invoke. The Jew has to be eliminated, every trace of the Jew, every memory of the Jew, starting with the children of the Jews, starting with the testimonies of the Jews, starting with anything associated with the Jews. The Jew represents a cosmic problem. The Jew is an essential contagion upon the body of humanity, according to this way of thinking. And it is systematic. It is sophisticated. It is calculated. and the Black Book attests to this quite thoroughly and quite well. I won't go into some of the things I pointed out yesterday about the assault on the holy within the human and human essence, but that is attested to here in this Black Book. The horror of the catastrophe known as the Holocaust is that it is an assault on the very thing that makes any horror horrible, any catastrophe catastrophic, and not just a matter of academic curiosity. It's something that summons us to the stand, something that makes witnesses out of all of us. Otherwise, the murderers in the world today can do their work unencumbered by troublemakers like Abba Sutzkever and Eliezer Yerushalmi and Elena Vividaiti Kutorgina. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Question? Yes, Ken.
Your presentation was especially meaningful to me because my parents are Lithuanian Jews, and made an escape in 1937 and 1938. Most everyone knows about the eradication of Polish Jewry. Not as many people know about the massacre of Lithuanian Jewry, and that's because the massacre was almost a total. And I believe that the percentage of the Jewish population killed was greatest, or maybe kind of fallen, of all of the...
More than 95%.
Right, no, 95% of the Jews in Lithuania were killed. So if we can move ahead 60 years, although I don't want to get into politics, it seems that Americans are rather pro-Jewish. There's a lot of anti-Semitism here. But the anti-Semitism in America, masquerading as anti-Israel sentiment, seems to be located primarily in universities, such as San Francisco State, Columbia, so on and so forth. Would you be kind enough to comment, since you're in academia, on your view of the fact that so much anti-Semitism under many guises is located among the intelligentsia of a certain political persuasion in the universities?
Well, that's a complicated question, and I'll try to give a simple answer to it. The thinking that rules among the world's intellectuals is a thinking in which all absolutes have been eliminated. All principles of good and evil have been eliminated. Anything like a revealed truth, a revealed commandment, the categories of holiness are not part of the thinking. It's a thinking that is rooted in a view of a reality that is a strictly material reality, governed by forces of various kinds, natural forces, social forces, cultural forces. There is among those intellectuals, therefore, an animosity toward anything that smacks of revealed truth, like Jewish tradition or Christian tradition for that matter. I mean, they are just as quick to mock and bash Christians as they are Jews for what they think. Now, in the case of Jews, however, I think it runs deeper. It certainly has a longer history. You have the idea that since a Jew is someone who's born a Jew, that the way of thinking must be somehow inherent, must be in the genes. So the Christians can be saved by being turned away from Christianity, but the Nazis had this idea that but the Jew can't be redeemed because his insidious ism is in his blood. There's also the point that I ended on last night, that the Jews, by their presence in the world, represent a call to an ethical answering for our neighbor. You know, where's your brother and what have you done? That voice from beyond comes through the Jewish people to the world, and it's a call that most of us don't want to hear because it disturbs our sleep. Somnambulism is rampant in academia. Oh my gosh, I'm at a university saying that. But I'm afraid, and in my view, that's the case. There's nothing like, the latest fashion or fad, postmodern this, meta that, to divert you and maintain a state of sleep. And the Jews have a nasty way, just of, their being there, of disturbing that sleep. It's a very simplistic answer, but there's a much longer and complicated answer to that, I think. It's another, yes, ma'am.
Last night, and then again at the end of your speech today, you mentioned that it wasn't about racism or more particularly anti-Jewishness. Elie Wiesel, whom you quoted last night, he himself has said, "I have learned that the Holocaust was a uniquely Jewish event, albeit with universal implications. Not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims."
Right.
You said that to the Nazis it was a cosmic problem and essential contagion. If it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. It was anti-Semitism, or more specifically anti-Jewishness, and I don't understand your statement.
That's my statement is your statement. It was Jew hatred driving it. First of all, a Jew is not a member of a race. Jews come, if race has anything to do with color or physiognomy, Jews come in all colors and all physiognomies. Anyone who's been to Israel and walked 2 blocks can see that. And certainly as I commented on briefly yesterday, the ideological category of race in the mouth of someone like Alfred Rosenberg is not about anything that meets the eye. It's about something hidden in the essence, in the blood, like a germ. There's that, and the germ is not just something that weakens the body of humanity. It poisons the mind, the Geist, the spirit of humanity with its Judaism, with its teaching. That's what's dangerous about the Jew. It's because every Jew, as Rosenberg says, is inclined to think Talmudically. You can't take the Talmud out of the Jew. You can't get it any more than you can, rid someone of a genetically based disorder. That's why it's not racism, at least not as we understand the term in our own culture. Yes, ma'am.
I believe that there is a resurgence of Jewish life in Lithuania today, and do you know much about that? Can you comment?
Yes, I was in Vilnius in 2006. And I was a speaker at the 100th anniversary conference on the 100th anniversary of the birth of Emmanuel Levinas. Very important, probably the most important Jewish thinker of the 20th century, although that could be argued. I was talking to the head of the Vilnius Jewish Historical Society, a Jewish man, who was also happened to be the new Lithuanian representative to the European Union. And he'd asked the local French ambassador to Vilnius to, say 5 minutes of welcoming remarks for this event honoring Emmanuel Levinas, French Jewish thinker. The French representative said, no, I can't do that. He's too Jewish. When I was in Vilnius, I went to the hotel clerk, said, is there a way I could, arrange for a car to Panari? Never heard of it. I'd like to talk to the manager. Never heard of it. Don't know anything about it. And I was I said, well, would you look into it? So he said, he called me a few hours later. He says, I found a car. They'll take you. It's 10 miles for $500 of pay. So that's just a taste of, attitudes towards Jews. And it was obvious that I was Jewish to them and that I was asking about Jewish things. And it's all through Eastern Europe. Russia, not a lot has changed. I pointed out to some students yesterday that the Russian Orthodox Church continues to publish and distribute the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So yeah, it's still there, yes.
A few years ago, I was in Lithuania, and my host said to me that the Lithuanians were virulently anti-Russian. And that it was just the fact that when the Tsar tried to russify Lithuania, he moved primarily Jews into Lithuania, and that was unfortunate circumstances that led to this Holocaust. Is there any truth to that statement?
No, well, I've heard that argument. I don't think it stands up to examination. I mean, the history of hatred way predates any move on the part of the Tsar to Russify Lithuania. Right. It predates Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, 16th century.
Well, what percentage of the Russians in Lithuania were Jewish?
That I couldn't say. I don't know. I know that now, probably 80% of the Jews in Lithuania are Russian. But it's a very tiny population, obviously. Yes, ma'am. Was there a hand over here? Yes, ma'am.
Minority about 2 years ago.
Ah.
And it was the most amazing thing that I've seen. My father was from Lithuania. And there are these big ants all over the whole field covered by these ants.
Wow.
And I would say that's because the Jews fighting back on them, they can't come back here. It was the most amazing experience that I've ever had. And I've traveled all over the world, but to go there and see that, the killing fields,
Yes.
what was there, and how they lived was amazing.
It's, and of course, all you're seeing is the faintest remnant.
Right.
Yeah. Other questions, comments? Yes, Jay.
When you're speaking about anti-Semitism among the intelligentsia and also the complicity of Lithuanian physicians helping Nazis or at least helping Nazi mission against the Jews, I'm wondering if you came across any at all of university professors in Lithuania actually speaking up or acting out on behalf of the Jews, or if they fulfilled Hitler's prophecy in Germany of the professors would be the
First to fall in line. Yeah, I mean, Hitler did make this comment that when asked, what are we going to do about the professors, they'll be the first to fall in line. No, they're no problem. The Black Book in the Lithuanian section does, in Sutskever's history of the Vilna Ghetto, it does contain a few examples of Lithuanian professionals, mostly doctors, who were helping the Jews. I don't recall anything on Lithuanian professors, but there are a couple of doctors, a couple of journalists that did come to the aid of the Jews, help to hide them, help to get them out. So the fact that you're a professor doesn't necessarily mean anything, as you know. No, it's my profession, and I'm afraid to say more. Yes, ma'am.
Just a comment, 2 years ago, we were in Vilnius
I went to a ceremony at the Jewish Community Center for the Righteous Gentiles, and it was a lot of the farmers hid when they could, and there was a whole pipeline that took the children up into Russia, and we met some of these people, and they said when they came back after the war, that all the villages were gone.
Oh, yeah.
They are trying to make a movie now, showing what happened to farmers and the pipelines that took the children, mostly the children they got.
It's, yes, we can't comprehend the destruction of a universe. There are more than 3,000 towns and villages no longer exist in Eastern Europe. You know, a language was wiped out. A literature, you know, all the cultural, all of the things that go into creating a culture, all of the things that take centuries to bring about. The scholars, as Elie Wiesel once said, it takes centuries to give birth to a scholar. They don't come out of nowhere. They come out of a very long tradition of learning and study and study. That is wiped out. 80% of the world's rabbis were murdered in the Shoah. I was at Elie Wiesel's 80th birthday gathering at Boston University a year ago. And among the other speakers there was David Weiss Halivni. David Weiss Halivni is one of the great Talmudists of our time. It's said that he knows the Talmud so thoroughly that if you stick a pin in a page, he can tell you what word it will come out on the other side. He's from Szeged. He and Elie Wiesel went to Cheder together. Childhood buddies. And it was so interesting to see the two of them sitting together, leaning to each other, you're wondering, what are they talking about? These two sages from one little town. How many were lost? How many were lost? I thought, what do they put in the water in that town to produce two men like this? Two, giants. But that devastation is immeasurable. It's immeasurable, but very real. Anything else? No? Thanks so much.